Hello, everyone. Welcome. I am Przemek Bosak, your host for today's Summer of AI event, and I will help facilitate and moderate this panel discussion. This dynamic panel will explore the promises and pitfalls of generative AI in higher education, and they will share diverse perspectives on how AI is reshaping teaching, learning, ethics, and the future of academia. The recording of this video presentation will be available at a later date. Please subscribe to the Summer of AI newsletter to stay informed about related AI tips. The format of this session will be a moderated talk for approximately 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A. So if you have any questions throughout this event, do not hesitate to place them in the online chat or the Q&A tab. A host will collect them and notify us. A thumbs up on your message or question will be used to confirm your question was received by the host. I'd like to introduce today's speakers. Dr. Mike Yao, the Professor of Digital Media and the Director of the Institute of Communications Research. Dr. Yao's research focuses on the social and psychological impacts of interactive digital media. Michael Curtin, adjunct faculty in the Informatics Department and the Innovation Coordinator for the Office of the Chief Information Officer, as well as an artist and game developer. Jake Metz, Assistant Director of Infrastructure at Immerse, the founder of the local Immersion Festival, and he has additionally served as Technical Director for a range of arts and technology events, while also designing technology-enhanced infrastructures for studios and venues. Dr. Meicen Sun, Assistant Professor in the School of Information Sciences, affiliated faculty with the MIT Future Tech. Her research examines the political economy of information, the geopolitics of data, and information policy. Welcome, everyone. We already had the discussion started off the air a few minutes before we joined you all on Zoom and in the room. I'd like to start off quite mildly, if there is such a thing. So a question to all of you, and you can chime in at any point if you like answering any of these questions. As academic professionals, how have you seen generative AI positively affect your work as well as your students' work?
I can start. Well, I don't really have many students these days. I don't interact with them as much, but I can certainly speak to my work and my colleagues' work. I think certainly the ability of large language model systems and in general generative AI has helped a lot with mundane kind of actuarial tasks, taking meeting notes, helping to keep everyone present in a meeting, and later on grab onto action items and surface some things that may have been lost. I know that at least in the kind of more administrative realm, a lot of us have a lot of meetings on many different topics, and we're not often left a large amount of time to go back and really replay and review that meeting over and over. And I did notice, in myself, it's much nicer to remain engaged when I'm meeting with people. And I might take a few notes, but it's been extremely helpful to be able to later extract these kind of action items, follow-ups, and any insights that came up amid a conversation.
I think as an educator, focus on a positive aspect of it. I'll just share two. One, I increasingly think that AI and then the technologies and applications serves as almost a reflection to a lot of things that we are already doing and doing it just because we're doing it. And it's this opportunity. I see this as a threat, but it's a threat that's in a positive way that forces students, faculty members, and institutions to really reflect on the questions: what do we do? Why do we do it? And then really to help us expose a lot of inefficiencies in our workflow, including the learning process, and then really force us to think about the value of various activities that we take for granted. So I think that to me is a very good opportunity, and I like to focus on that. The second, I think that it evens out a lot of the playing field for a lot of students. And I really think that just to cite one example, language barriers and separating the sort of language as art, as creative, and language as a essential communication tool. So I think if we, there are a lot of issues that we will discuss, I'm sure, about creativity and copyright and other issues, but if we're strictly focusing on language use for the sake of communication and clarity, it really takes away a lot of the issues that comes with assuming certain language because more scientific research is published in certain languages and certain formats, certain forms of writing that really stops the wider sharing of knowledge across the globe. So I think that evens out that playing field to bring different perspectives in and reduce that friction in communication is another positive thing that I can see.
Meicen, Michael?
I'll go after.
What I think is most compelling about it is generative AI's ability to translate, and not specifically from language to language, but from ideas. So if you're particularly good at one thing, you can apply that knowledge laterally to a place where you may have a lack of words. You don't know the terminology, you don't know the context. It can kind of fill in those gaps and allow your skills in one area to be applied, at least theoretically, into another area. Meaning that, like, you're a good auto mechanic, you're not going to suddenly do brain surgery, but you would understand how those two systems are similar, and it would allow you to take knowledge you've already accumulated in one area and kind of piggyback onto another area. Again, don't, actually be a brain surgeon or anything, but it's tremendously helpful because you kind of have so much momentum with things that we already know, and you're not starting at zero with new ideas.
Yeah, I basically, I want to go last because I'm pretty sure all of my colleagues will have covered a lot of the ground that I wanted to. Especially I want to emphasize this barriers, the language barrier factor, because I can definitely see a lot of confidence boosting factor that has had already on the students with who speak English as a second language, myself included. So, and that also relates to this first point about automating tasks that don't involve as much creativity while leveling the playing field for like foreign students and students who didn't perhaps speak a certain language, and that kind of mitigating that kind of inherent bias, language-induced bias in science, and just like creativity and knowledge in general. But essentially just reiterating a lot of what people already said.
So we've talked about the positives. Have you seen generative AI hinder you or your students? And if so, how?
Well, I was just going to say, going off Mike's point, and I think you said you could think of the negatives, so I'm sure this is in your mind. Yes, we have the opportunity to reflect on what and why we do, right? But there is a downfall in our assessment systems are, let's say, easily hacked by large language models now, right? So I guess the danger or a negative impact could be that our assessment metrics and the way we teach people and the way we understand what they've learned may not be able to adapt all that quickly. And there's a danger that there's a current crop of students, a current cohort that's in the in-between, right? They're in this moment where we have not adapted our teaching practices and our assessment practices, and they're maybe able to just write essays using LLMs without spending too much time thinking. And I'm worried about what happens as those people go forward.
To piggyback off that, any skill you have is something like it's like a knife that you constantly have to sharpen. You have to do it all the time. It's not like you get good at something and then you drop it for 10 years and you're still just as good as you were 10 years ago. You got to work at it. And we have this is a generalization, but we have students today who grew up in communicating with one another, not like through letters or through formal prose and email, where they're texting one another. And the texts that I used when I was 19 on a cell phone are very different in format from the text that students use today. There's a tremendous amount of shorthand. These are not complete sentences. And this is something where now we're moving into a situation where even in academics, they are less likely, because of generative AI, to drill into that skill set, to actually be able to create a long form paper, to complete, to even communicate in complete sentences. And if it's something you just never do and you miss all those opportunities, there's a potential that they're going to get dropped into the working world, never really having had to do it at all. meaning extremely limited capability to set up a problem in writing, flesh out why they have a potential solution, run through the scenarios, and then like show a path forward. All the things that you may have gotten used to if you were my age aren't necessarily required because of these tools and because that scenario has completely been destabilized.
I mean, there are many potential threats and negative things I can think of, but I think the one issue that I'm dealing with and I'm concerned about is that how quickly the AI applications has developed for very narrow specific purposes. And frankly, there are many products are not very good. They're sort of in a sense that really when a large language model was really broadly introduced and dropped to the public, there was that moment of creative use. And then I'm seeing that those who are very creative, intellectually driven, and curious would use the tool very differently because they're exploring other possibilities. But how quickly you start to see these very specifically narrow defined applications of AI led to in many ways, a very sort of a dependent of AI on AI to perform a very specific task, and then you become a habitual user of that one specific function, and to not realize the sort of the much bigger, broader potentials that it can bring. So in that sense, we're creating that everybody might use AI, but those who use it in one way may actually benefit their work, become more creative and more productive. And then you start seeing the other extreme that those become very quickly rely on it to perform one or two tasks, then they offload. And then I'm seeing a new kinds of divide, knowledge gap and digital divide, not in terms of technology's capability or even accessibility, but in terms of how people, who we are and our individual differences in intellectual curiosity and willingness to explore, try different things, and quickly sort of dividing these users into power users who use it to really increase productivity and creativity, and those who become very dependent and start to use it for very narrow purposes and lead to some other issues.
Piggyback off that a little bit. I don't think that's new, right?
Yeah, exactly.
mean,
Yeah, I was going to say that. Yeah.
That's this is almost every technology that's been introduced, or certainly most of the information technologies that have been introduced follow that same path, right? You can have a power user where, I'm using the fact that I have a smartphone in my hand even before AI to open up this access to allow my imagination to explore this vast information space, or I can sit on it playing Candy Crush all day, right? And so there's always going to be, this may amplify, and I think this is just the general trend is the information technology continues to accelerate, and so the divide maybe.
No, I completely agree.
Widen,
yeah, I think it's the amplification of it and how the magnitude of it, and also the acceleration, how fast it got to this point. I mean,
so then the real issue is not the AI; it's the systems that are delivering it, right?
Absolutely.
Right? Why is so much human economic activity being organized around delivering this very narrow product, right? I think the answer is rampant capitalism.
You took my word, Jake. You almost read my mind. I was going to quote another high school professor, Christopher Luke, from whom I learned that there's a lot of data to back up the 80-20, I think he called the 80-20 rule, by which with any technology, 80% of the users only learn to use 20% of its capabilities. And so I think AI, generative AI fits the same category. Another, it's just like Jake said, it's nothing, it's not a new phenomenon with any technology or with any tool. You've got, the power users, comprise perhaps the 20% of all the users, if that.
But I think these are very interesting things, say in that people in the iSchool, like Christopher Luke and others, think about, right? This points at, what are we teaching people? And information literacy and information technology literacy, it becomes increasingly important. I mean, it's always been important, but now it's increasingly important. How do you teach people to be those power users, right? To be creative, Can you? Or are we
I
just,
mean, like on this point, right, essentially what I have been hearing, and also of course, like adding my personal experience to this, is when we talk, the moment we talk about there's the maintain tasks and then there's the creative tasks, right? That is what makes things really complicated because where do you draw the line? And we are all humans and we've all been students, and therefore we all know too well that the tendency there is, because learning is hard, because thinking is hard, because creative, complex thinking is always the hardest thing, even though it's eventually rewarding if you do the hard work. But then at the get-go, right, the human tendency is always to relegate it to later, to relegate it to someone else. And now we have that someone else 24/7. We now finally know what it feels like, even though we don't really acknowledge that we are just relegating and postponing things to, temporarily, or to someone else, to something else right now, right? But we don't like to acknowledge that as laziness, essentially, at the end of the day. And we prefer instead to tell ourselves these are just non-essential, right, non-creative tasks. But in reality, I'm saying this because I come from a field where it's just like barely over a decade ago, but we had to do 1,000 pages of reading a week, right? I don't think that's specific to, I think that's fairly common actually to a lot of fields, even just like 5 years ago before the total takeover this just 3 years ago. And nowadays that's just becoming almost a rarity, I want to say, in classrooms. The moment you expect people to read more than a 200-word summary of anything, that's considered, that's wasting my time almost. I don't think it's that bad yet, but we're going there. That's where we're headed. But then if you think of, reading the full articles and books versus reading a 200-word summary of everything, obviously you're not putting the same things in your head. And you are essentially just getting these skeletal sketches of everything that also has all sorts of biases inherent in all these models, because you are getting the summaries distilled from a model in a particular kind of way, not necessarily the summary that you would have gotten from reading these things yourself. And that's a huge difference. And at the end of the day, when that has been accumulated for some time, you are essentially comparing a brain, right, with all these knowledge points that you have strenuously harvested yourself versus these very scarce knowledge points. And knowledge creation at the end of the day is about making connections between points in our brain and making new connections. When you have so few connections to begin with, we kind of know what to expect there. So
just to follow up on that, I think that's a very compelling perspective, that in many ways, I think it's too early. And for me, based on some of the research that we're doing, we're seeing that we're too quickly to start to see AI as a tool, as a functioning tool, rather than an intelligence. Like, we're forgetting that the word intelligence carries a certain connotation and means something more than just task performance or doing things or editing your paper. A deeper in a conversation, really, what we have right now is this differentiation between doing something for utilitarians, like for your work, get something quickly done so I can go play golf, versus doing something that is out of a curiosity, learning, or creativity, right? So in a sense, that reading a paper, a 1,000-page document, if the goal is to quickly read it so that you can move on and do the next step, you outsource it. The humans don't necessarily read it. But on the other hand, if reading that 1,000 document is a curious endeavor, it's something that I wanted to do, and then having the AI read it, but without me having to read it, makes this whole point moot. In other words, I cannot carry a conversation because it's almost working with somebody. I outsource that. I cannot have a dialogue with it. So my view on this is, going off on tangent, is that AI in a way reflects the human user's ability, because a fifth grader uses AI, the AI is just as smart as the fifth grade. But if a scientist uses AI to do research and discover knowledge, and then there's that kind of reciprocity and a communication and bilateral communication and partnership that really hinges on the intelligence and the knowledge and the ability of that human user to evaluate the knowledge, to actually fully realize it. Because AI is smart as the human user, that particular human user wanted to be or make it to be. And then I think that dynamic changes, at least to me, moves the AI away from it being a specific tool like a calculator. I use it for this purpose because it really is much more dynamic and it's much more fluid than what we typically think of the AI applications today right now for among a lot of lay users.
One thing I'm interested in asking you about, we are reaching this point that we're in kind of the intellectual economy, right? There are ever more people participating, and there is ever more information and papers and studies being published, such that we reach a point where it's physically impossible for any human to actually read all of this, right? So there is some balance between figuring out how to force or encourage someone because they're curious to do enough of the strenuous labor, right, to build their mind, and then at some point you reach a level where, well, you're never going to be able to read any more than you already can, right, with the amount of time you have, and there's increasingly exponentially more knowledge and information that if you can access and leverage, would be very useful to you, right? So I guess I'm interested in your perspective there, right? There has to be AI is a tool that's coming about at a time where it is also necessary to be able to make sense of the information overload that our world has created.
Yeah, just so quickly before, we move on to bigger, scarier topic.
Yeah.
There's a reason why Vannevar Bush, the July 1945 essay, As We May Think, is required piece of reading for all students in our department, in our school. And he basically exactly 80 years ago to this month, he predicted this information explosion, and he proposed this idea of the so-called Meicen machine. Despite how antiquated that idea was, it was just extremely far-visioned, because this is literally what he was predicting at the time. So I find your question very relevant to what Mike just said a moment ago, which is people use information, people process information to very different ends. And I find it funny because I don't know how representative this panel is in the general population. We are probably the least representative people, for the reason that maybe the purely utilitarian folks, they are the vast majority of the population. They really want to just get in and out, give me the gist of this so that I can hand out my work and then play golf. Versus this weird group of us, we enjoy this process for its own sake, and then we want to exercise this part of our kind of like intellectual muscle just for its own sake. We enjoy the hard work, we join the brain sweating and all. So to that end, I think, yes, that's what gets us to this, what's the ideal mix of handing off these tasks so that we can most effectively leverage the creative facilities in our mind. At the same time, I'm not sure if that is what the majority are hoping to achieve, which is why we are having this sort of conundrum where I think we're heading there right now, of being educators with a set of goals that we prefer to enact ourselves versus what most of our students are trying to get out of this education. The misalignment there, or potential misalignment there, is, I think, the deeper reason why we're seeing a lot of this kind of supply demand mismatch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, but the misalignment is being driven, I think, by society, right? I mean, there's a way that we can tie this back to the erosion of the middle class and the accumulation of wealth at the top, right? People are using this for utilitarian purposes because that's the world they're in, because they need to get things done to make money to survive. There's not, and we, I guess, are not representative. Academia has long been this bubble that we create an alternative society, somewhat separated from the external economic reality, so that we have time to sit and ponder, and it's a privilege to be able to do that, right?
Exactly. Yeah. If I could just say one last thing, which I think your comments really highlight the importance of institutions and social education policy, the importance, just how big of a difference these policy decisions can make, especially in a time of transformation like we are seeing right now. What does it mean to still have a general education? I think that definition has to change. I think it's way past due time that we took a re-reckoning of what it means to have a generally good education compared to 5 years ago, and how that in turn necessitates very big, I think, necessary sea changes in curriculum design and what is required, and how do you design the required curricula such that it forces students to exercise the truly necessary muscles that everyone does need to keep active, versus where students can pick and choose what parts of their kind of facilities they choose to hone in on.
I agree.
Yeah, well, I look at you, Michael, because I know that, and I'm sorry for hijacking this from you.
No, it's fine.
But I mean, Michael, I think you probably have some things to say about this. I know, at least from our talks, over the past few years, you're a person who has started to think about how you're bringing different generative AI tools into the classroom and encouraging people to use them, hopefully in ways that still help them cultivate their own critical thought and their own creativity.
The front line is in the classroom, in my opinion, because you have a tremendous amount of frustration on the part of students who are seeing the world as they understood it yanked out from underneath them at a very tender time, meaning they're about to leave the safety of what I would still clump in as like childhood, and become an adult and be responsible for themselves. And they thought they had one leg in the future because they're lucky enough to be in this country going to college. And what they're finding is that things are changing so very quickly, and generative AI, whether it's true or not, is marketed as the root of that change, as the vehicle through which all this change is occurring. And they, like the rest of us, have no idea what is about to happen. But they don't have jobs yet. They don't have security. They don't have a career momentum. So they are starting out in a very gray area. And there's a tremendous amount of frustration on their part, again, to generalize, because some of them love it, because that insecurity isn't really, they have no defense for it. They have no way to say, this is the clear path forward, these are my expectations, because everything that has to do with technology is now being disrupted because of this tool. And this tool is also attacking things that they love in their personal life, meaning that music and art and all these things are evolving very quickly. Some people would say it's very productive that people who are not traditionally trained artists can suddenly create art with the push of a button. But people who are traditionally trained artists understand that the work is like, the value is the work, the process. If you jump to the end of a process, be it learning something new or creating something, you've missed the point entirely. And so I have to be incredibly delicate about how I even talk about generative AI in the classroom, because some view it as an existential threat and others view it as a necessity for which they're going to need to, embrace in order to survive in any job, any field, period.
I wanted to go back to something a point you brought up, Michael, about 10 minutes ago or so, about the quality of the text messages nowadays versus 20 years ago or so, and so hypothetically, you get a student, a senior, who's very good at creative writing, who writes cohesively, explores their ideas in great depth. Wouldn't those skills be even more valuable nowadays when the landscape, is where people don't communicate effectively, where they write in acronyms and things of that nature? Wouldn't those critical thinking and creative writing skills, wouldn't they be even more valuable nowadays? Shouldn't we as educators be honing in on those skills even more than before to create opportunities for these undergraduate students?
To combine something Mike said with something Jake said, we really are in a situation where we want to, AI is allowing people to understand just how valuable that is. Many of the skills we had to use in our normal life before generative came along were just ambient. Of course, you know how to write a letter. Of course, you know how to communicate effectively with text, because that's what you have to do to get almost anything done in school or in work. Those are now becoming special almost. And that is bizarre, but also that spotlight that this shift that generative AI has introduced into the workforce and education and everything else is allowing some people to say, this is something that I never even really understood. It was like air, it was always just around, but suddenly it's precious. Suddenly I'm going to, with intentionality, invest my time to get good at something that I know that generative AI could just do for me. I could use an easy button. I've done it before. Maybe I've tried it and I understand the value that going through the hard work, making all of those granular decisions, be it science or design or anything else, is going to, as a way to invest in myself. And it didn't used to be like that because you just had to do stuff yourself. There was no one that was going to show up and save you or help you or smooth over the rough parts. Now, because that's possible, some people actually see the value in investing in themselves in those ways.
I think it also I mean, it comes down to how people want to spend their time. Some things are worthwhile spending time putting that effort in. Some things are not. Like you did talk about writing like letters as a way to facilitate work or something, right? Frankly, I'm happy to let AI write my perfunctory emails about scheduling or following up on things. I don't need to be spending my cognitive energy sitting there and like thinking of the perfect wording, because at the end of the day, the person on the other side, they're not sitting there and like reading my email as this wonderful thing that they need to take in, right? I would rather, I mean, I think the thing is this, it makes interpersonal time, being together in real time and exploring ideas and communicating with one another more valuable. Versus, I do think it's the written word continues to be important, but I think what this is highlighting is the value of spending real time with other people and engaging in ideas that way.
There's always a trade-off though. So if you write less, even things that make you miserable, you are not sharpening that knife for those writing skills. So let's say you suddenly enter a situation where you're like, I am looking forward to writing something. And you're going to realize all I've been doing for weeks now is giving very vague instructions to a chatbot.
Sure.
I haven't sharpened that knife in weeks.
Right.
And suddenly you are sharpening the knife while you are meant to be doing something like impactful. And you want to concentrate your time on something you care about. But there is a price to pay. That it gets dull.
Yeah. I mean, I guess, and again, I don't, as you pointed, I don't know if we're representative, but something I find myself doing now is handing off some of that perfunctory, mundane writing to AI and say, yes, write this. I don't care. This is not worth my time. And I will say, I mean, I enjoy writing. I did as a younger person. I was adept at creative writing. Now I don't do it as much, but I spend a lot more time speaking. I actually do a lot of monologuing and dictating to transcription systems. That's how I process my creative critical thought, is speaking aloud or having conversations with other people. And so I think that, again, it's a balance of if we can use these tools to reduce the amount of time we have to spend on the mundane work that is required of us in much of our work life. The key is ensuring and putting this desire, I think, if we're talking about higher education, into our students that what do you do with your free time? How do you spend that? Do you spend it with other people? Do you spend it exercising your intellectual muscles? And the only way to do that is not necessarily sitting down to write an essay. There's lots of ways people can exercise their critical thought.
Yeah.
We have an audience comment question, or wants to hear, what do you guys think about this? Perhaps part of the challenge with students is that we know something about the usefulness of the skills and knowledge we are teaching, which they may not have the life career perspective to see that usefulness of it. What do you all think about that? This is from Jennifer Cromley.
I don't know if I understand the question.
I'll take that as, and Jennifer can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think she's talking about responsibility, because everyone lives life a day at a time, a week at a time. Students live a very different life than most of us. They live on campus. Most of the people they know are right here. Their experience of campus is often a digital experience of campus, whereas we may traditionally think like campus is a bunch of buildings and sidewalks, and it's bars and things like that. That may not be their experience. But at the end of the day, we have to not only teach them what a specific course is meant to do, but also project into the future, like, this is why this matters to you, even though your life may be very, very different than mine. This is how what I'm teaching you now might be less stable than it would have been 5 years ago because of the introduction of these new technologies. And while it's not every single faculty member's on campus's job to be able to do that future forecasting and really point and say, this is how it's exactly going to go, you have to let people know that things are different. Things are different now because of technology than they even were 5 years ago. And 5 years ago was nuts compared to 10 years before that. And that's a trend that we're seeing, where that quickening of change is getting faster and faster and faster, which makes our job harder.
And just to follow up on an earlier comment by Meicen, that I think it's a moment to really rethink what we mean by education and learning, in instruction and mentoring and advising. I mean, these are terms that we use sometimes interchangeably, sometimes we just lump them together. It really forces us at this moment, it's really forces us to convey our value a little bit more clearly, to really understand what we do. Because going forward to the I completely agree with Jennifer's point. This is something that there's a sense that we've walked a path, we've seen the landscape before, the kind of pitfalls and challenges and barriers and different detours that one might take. So we come back and say, this is valuable. And then we create an institution to educate our youth to say, hey, here's the path you're going to walk. We're going to ease your way into it. It's kind of like a video game. We're training at the easiest skill. But this is a moment where we say, well, our knowledge is no longer enough. Many of us don't know what's ahead of us. We're walking that path too. And I would think that being able to convey and make the students see, or the responsibility is not so much we hold on to a set of values that we believe to be true, but really explore that with the students, with the learners, to kind of help them discover, say, here's a whole new map that we need kind of walk around and explore together. We happen to be a little bit more experienced, and here is a playground that we kind of created that we could take a little bit of risk, right? And then that's one thing. And the second, just going back to earlier comment, a lot of these values, we take it for granted. It's like, oh, art is important, creative writing is important, writing is a skill important. It's not until we really have to articulate. I recently having debates with my son about the value of advanced calculus, for a 16-year-old. And this is an interesting conversation, because I'm forced to articulate a value and find different ways of convincing him that everything you learn is eventually useful. That process made me smarter, because I had to think about this much more deeply and answer the question in the way that he could accept. So I will stop here and taking a lot of time, but I just think that there's a lot to be explored, and the responsibility is on our end, that as educators, we really need to re-examine our value.
And I think the irony there is reaffirming everything you just said. Our roles as educators, I think in this context, are becoming more important, not less important, but it becomes less visible, so as to, it may have the illusion that we're just retreating to the background when we're doing anything but. We are really sort of trying to guide them on what I call a more meta level with respect to these tools. And I find this, I think it makes our jobs harder, in the sense that it's harder to see where we're doing the work, when I think our work is actually more meaningful and important in that regard. But that comes with the job, I guess.
I'd like to go off script a little bit and to follow up on your comments, Mike, is that so as a university and as academic professionals, have we done enough? Have we articulated those values enough? Have we done good enough a job of transmitting and explaining those values to our students, to make them care about learning, about creativity, about the things you just mentioned?
I remember as a student, I mean, I don't know, that question, I don't know if it makes much sense. Some of us have, some of us haven't. And it depends also on the student and teacher relationship. Some students get more from the teachers than others. I mean, I can remember from my undergraduate days, there were some professors that really helped communicate those values and inspired me to, I think wonder is a very important thing, right? Yes, advanced calculus, we can use that. I had one teacher at some point, for say Calc 2, and that was very much interested in explaining how advanced calculus tied into my life. Why does this matter, right? What are the deeper lessons? And then I will say I took another calculus class where we used, I think, Mathematica at the time or something. And I will say it was very interesting to all of a sudden be able to visualize 3D vector fields on a computer screen. However, that professor didn't even try to explain to us why this was useful. They gave us the assignments. We were expected to turn in the assessments, and it was nice to see it on a screen. But there wasn't I felt I got less of a deep understanding, even though I had this wonderful visualization tool, than I did from using pen and paper with a professor that really cared about the deeper reasoning for learning this topic. So I think it's a mixed bag. And at a research institution, it's particularly a mixed bag because some people are here because they're wonderful researchers and maybe not a great teacher.
I think it may not be to just answer questions that, way above my pay grade, but really, besides what Jake said about individual differences in research, I think one thing is that we really need to start thinking about some of the institutions that we take for granted, like so the curriculums and courses and credits and the number system. We really have to think. I mean, I tend to think that this is a moment where we really need to rethink the whole thing of what we do and why we do it, and then really find some solutions and not necessarily solutions. Try something that's completely outside the box. And in the sense that I just going off on a tangent here, that I have a very difficult time accepting that art and humanities are not important because AI it's more STEM. Right? This is less so, but I'm seeing a lot of talk about the irrelevance of humanities subjects. The fact that is, if you did not study art history and did not study aesthetics and did not have enough knowledge to explore these things, you cannot use AI to either generate or appreciate the work. There's no base for your evaluation. If you yourself is not a good writer, or at least have read widely, you're not in a position to evaluate whether AI has done a good job writing this assignment or not. So it's going back to think that a lot of things that we finally say we can free our students' time to do less of that kind of a simply learning it because of the tools, because of skills we need, to actually really unleash some of the potentials that they may have when they were young. But the language they need is not how to use AI. Ironically, I think that the thing is that we need to teach them more about the things that they didn't have time to read, so that they now use the AI to actually accomplish some things that they're in a position to use AI more effectively. So I think that's just one example of sort of the way in which we set up curriculums in different colleges and different boundaries, different silos. And this is time really to kind of shake things up a little bit, but
I agree. Do you think that an institution of this size is nimble enough to do that? Or the institution of our entire you were saying as well, all the way down the education system. And I think this probably brings up another question Shamik had here was, I think we're likely to see the next narrow product of AI be personalized education, right? And can these huge institutions with a lot of inertial mass behind them and all of the credits and the numbers that we assess people by, can that move fast enough to compete with smaller interests that might be creating agentic systems for personalized education?
Well, big institutions can always start in small things, small steps. And I think some of the imperative small steps that we should absolutely consider taking is, we have been talking a lot about what we expect students to do more. We expect them to continue exercising their intellectual muscle. We expect them to still be diligent in reading and exercising their creativity. But what about our responsibilities as educators in terms of we expect students to do more, but there's also more that we should be doing. And one simple thing is, I think things like handing off grading to things like AI detection tools. I think things like that should be banned, and not the AI tools themselves, like for the students, instead of like banning the uses of AI tools. for the students. Of course, if you're doing an in-person exam for monitoring purposes, of course, that's legitimate, but just an outright ban by the educator, things like that should be really discouraged, if not banned instead. And I think it's just, grossly irresponsible for the teacher or educator to use these detection tools to punish students because it makes their jobs easier. Because I think they should instead be having more face time with the students. They should be having just more direct critical thinking, encouragement and mentoring with students. But of course, that takes time. And instead, you use these highly unreliable tools to pretend to fulfill your role as the educator. And I think, honestly, because now we know there's huge positives, huge false positives and negatives, which also has its own ethical implications on top of this kind of pedagogical laziness at its core. I think that's what
And it is a hypocrisy and irony.
Yeah.
I mean, you're using AI tools to detect AI
Yeah.
and to do the job. I mean, what's the difference? I mean, yeah, thank you for pointing that out.
So hope there on the faculty's part is that they can turn the page backwards and go back to a time where this stuff didn't exist and undo the opportunity that students see in using these tools to, potentially jump to the end of an assignment and not go through the very uncomfortable part of learning, which is the point of us all being here. And they can't. There's no way to kind of take something and cleanly cut it off and say, my classroom exists in 2020. And that's how we will conduct this course. That isn't a possibility. Unless you completely change how you assess students.
But that goes back to the point of that's the intellectual laziness.
Yeah.
I mean, every good course is a good course. You design, it's the misalignment of incentives that you have to use these very specific standardized rules to force student to go through the learning process, because that defeats the purpose of education to begin with. I mean, learning, yes, we know that this is valuable. It's also our responsibility job to actually align the incentives so that the learners will actually walk through this willingly, happily, in an engaging way, rather than just because they are a student. I mean, we're dealing with a generation or perhaps generations of people to say they're going to challenge us why. The just because you're an institution, just because I need a degree, therefore I need to follow your rules. I mean, that proposition itself needs to be challenged. I mean, how do we design the learning experience to better align that incentive and motivation to make them engage?
But I guess I'm not a faculty member, so I don't know, but I recall having faculty members giving us some paper we had to do, and me pushing back on them even some years ago and saying, this is dumb, why am I doing this? And they're like, well, I have to have this because the institution requires me to have these assessment metrics, right? So at some point, is it the laziness of any intellectual laziness of any individual faculty, or again, is it what does the system actually require to say you have a class, or you have to have assignments? I assume is something when you get a course approved. You can't say we're going to, right now at least, I don't think you can say we're going to have a 4-credit-hour class and all of the assessments are we're just sitting in a circle and playing intellectual debate game where we really push each other to test our knowledge. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that would not be an acceptable way to propose a course to the institution.
Yeah. I don't think it's laziness at the institutional level, but it's at the inertia.
Yes,
This
yeah,
sort
not-
of this momentum. I mean, in a sense, I mean, it's still conceptually, I still think it's kind of laziness in
Yeah.
the sense that rinse and repeat,
Sure.
right? And I don't think rinse and repeat will work, because rinse and repeat, anything that's rinse and repeatable, that's not a word, can be replaced by AI. That's really the reality. So the more we standardize it, the more we break down complex tasks into steps, the more we treat this as some sort of very highly scientifically sort of, unpacked process and make it into a process. That in itself is programming. That's algorithm. And that is any activity that can be done this way is really essentially can be replaced in the near future. So
The outcome can be replaced, but so much of what learning institution is not the outcome, it's the process. Again, the very uncomfortable, awkward part where you're like, I am bad at this because I am a student and I'm going to suffer through doing poorly at something in service of learning, in service of getting good at it. And so having that easy button for art, for writing, for music, or anything is incredibly tempting to students who just want to get to the end. They just want to get to the finish line. And it's an opportunity. I mean, going to college is a complete privilege, completely. It's a miracle for those who get to go from all over the world. And if you find yourself rushing through it to get to the end, you will have done yourself a tremendous disservice. And communicating that to students, but also letting faculty who are using it to develop the courses that we're talking about, like letting everyone know that there's a price to pay when you engage with these tools. You get time back, but you miss something along the way. And do you care about what you're missing, or do you really just want to kind of get to the end?
I think, yes, I agree with that. In the use of the tools, the narrow tools that we are currently provided, I do think there's a lot of opportunity if we can encourage more, say something like AI sovereignty, where we're not just using the corporately provided tools, right? But we encourage people to engage with these tools on a more granular level and engage with them in a way that adapts to their own processes, as opposed to taking the ready-made solution and hitting the easy button.
Yeah, I use them in a very bizarre way. I
Me too.
use them as like thought scaffolding,
Yes.
a way to kind of use generative AI as a living notebook where I use voice to talk to AI, and it can remind me of things that I'd forgotten about in a conversation that I had with it 3 months ago. And it's just a very different approach, because the goal is to change my thinking as opposed to saying, I want an outcome. I want a 2-sheet, piece of paper that's the work. No, the goal is that I think differently about something because I've invested time in it. But that's harder to market, to be honest. And the people who are, spending billions of dollars to propel and lend momentum to these tools and services have to promise people something. What they're promising them is that easy button. And that's where it gets really marketing. So.
Yeah, there's literacy, right? There's literacy in the tools and knowing what's available, knowing that you can do it differently than, like, I don't have to go to ChatGPT, right? I can go to there are all sorts of tools, like LobeChat is one, right? And I can, we'll talk about it later. But you can grab a variety of open source models, right? And you can start to put them into your own interfaces and build your own workflows. But that does take both a literacy of the available tools and this kind of desire to reflect on your own critical process, reflect on your own thoughts, right? Go through that perhaps arduous or strenuous process of reflection and deep learning and mental processes that are sometimes uncomfortable.
Yeah, I'd love if we could teach them.
I believe there are some questions from the Zoom audience.
Yep, so Elizabeth asks, comments and kind of asks here, in terms of pros and cons of generative AI and its necessary versus optional uses, I'd be curious to hear the panel's comment on the massive energy, water resources that AI requires, and discuss existing or potential higher ed practices to make people aware of the environmental impacts as they're deciding how often and what purposes to use AI tools for. I was just going to add, even locally, if you're in the, in the Champaign-Urbana area, Meta is investing heavily in our local nuclear power plant in Clinton, Illinois, to keep them alive for 30 years. So this is legit. What's any commentary?
I mean, there have been many studies and many statistics that have, I think, a variety of conclusions about the energy and water uses. What we do know is that the energy requirements are, undoubtedly increasing with this explosion of this new technology. I mean, some of that points to, as Michael said, the way it's being marketed. I mean, I think there's kind of this, I don't know, trivial usage of AI, and we're asking it to do dumb things, right? And that, because that's what it's kind of being marketed to drive people's adoption. I do think that in some cases, the models have gotten much more efficient. Since some of those, I remember there was an early study maybe 3 years ago that talked about the water usage. And I mean, even then I did kind of a back of the envelope of my own usage. And even if I talked to AI back and forth like all day long, it was essentially equivalent to me taking a shower that was 3 minutes less or something. And so I think there's kind of a gotcha in that question. And I'm like, okay, if you really care about water usage, like maybe don't have a lawn in Arizona, or maybe, cut down on the length of your showers, and you're going to do a lot more for water conservation than not using AI at this point.
And also drive less.
Yeah.
Have fewer
Right,
cars,
right.
use more public transportation and build more public transportation. The ironic thing, I recall this conversation with a friend of mine a couple of years ago, and there is basically a body of study on, greenwashing practices by businesses and hotels in particular. One really fun example, a contrast is, there's this transition from like the small shampoo bottles to the wall mounted, the large bottles to save energy and to be more environmental friendly. Does it help? Yes, but by how much? And again, the ironic thing there is if you actually do the math, what will help the most, or a measure that will help tremendously more than these bottle practices is to basically dial down the ACs to make it a lot colder in the winter and a lot hotter in the summer. But how will that attract customers, and how will that help the business of the hotels and but that actually helps. So I hope this will not become actually one of those things when so we're talking about the saving side, right? So yes, I think every student, every newcomer, everyone should be acquainted with the environmental costs. I think that should be part of the primer to ethics of AI use and everything. But at the same time, we probably should think a lot harder about things like renewable energy, things like fusion energy that I don't think is being talked about nearly enough, because that is going to be potentially a huge game changer if we do it right. And maybe the thinking of getting us there will involve a lot of the use of generative AI in the process. But I'm just saying there are two sides of things, and I think both are important, and we should be doing one thing, one at the expense of the other.
And one other point there is something interesting to think about is, yes, like if Meta is investing in, say, the Clinton power plant, or Microsoft is trying to, get however many new nuclear power plants brought online in North Carolina. I mean, I think also we should revisit the stigma of nuclear power in this country. But one interesting point here is the power generation, right, is a public utility. And yet we're saying we need to invest in all of this power generation in order to support something, the compute or the generative AI services that are owned by corporations that are not a public utility. So there's an interesting, I don't have a question, but it's an interesting thing to think about, in the fact that we have energy that's a public utility that's largely being built to support a non-public utility.
I believe, sorry to interrupt. We're almost at time, but I'd like to give Bob a chance to ask his question.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's an unfair question with 2 minutes left to the hour, so please, give your CNN, whatever. I was going to maybe direct it at Meicen here, because my brain is connecting things, just like you all said, is the value here. And I know I've heard that on average, people take care of their pets better than they maybe take care of themselves. So I've been thinking, back to responsibility as the flagship university of the state, how are you what would you advise Western to do in this moment? And would your advice to Western or Eastern help us know what we should be doing ourselves, right? If you have now an afternoon to play golf, do you maybe more play 9 holes of golf and go teach a course at Western? I don't know, like where do you think our energy should be spent on that outward looking? Because you were talking so much about the general public, and I'm thinking about our land grant mission. What can we be doing for the state of Illinois? Yeah.
Are there any locals on this panel?
Oh,
right.
Okay.
Him first, and then I
Sure.
can supplement.
Sure.
I can tell you, having been raised in Champaign, that the University of Illinois is a bubble. It's a miracle that it's here, given the fact that this is the second. This is the state that has knocked down the most of its forests to turn it into farmland over any other. We have almost no natural spaces here, and we find ourselves in a situation where it's an engine for agriculture. That's also, by the way, the reason the University of Illinois exists here at all. Now, that was the reason that I got rooted here in the cornfields. What has happened since is astonishing. And the fact that we still have cachet going all the way back to the 50s and 60s regarding technology means that people listen to us. We have a microphone. Some say we should have a bigger microphone. Some say we are resting on our laurels. I don't want to weigh in on that topic. But when people listen to you, you have a tremendous amount of responsibility to take even ideas that are not original to you and to get them out there, to be very loud in situations like this where people really don't know what's happening. And people are feeling a tremendous amount of insecurity about the future, because we do have very, very wise people, like the other people of this little talk here, who have an opportunity to use that microphone to the best of them.
And also, I think, just to add to that, we are the flagship of the state, but we're also a highly international campus, and how that inherently entails a set of trade-offs and balancing acts on the part of the administrators and leadership. So we are in very international campus, which obviously has its benefits. On the other hand, we also have some of the, I think, highest in-state tuition rates, which I think explains a lot of these recent changes in demographics of the student population. So I think, though, if you look at the math, and if you look at, because the math translates into market incentives or just incentives in general, and that translate into a lot of these transformation and changes that you would otherwise have a hard time understanding. So I think getting to the root cause of a lot of these things, the political economy, the money matters, the power matters, will give us some guidance as we think through these higher order questions that you posed about how to best cater to the student needs, because we want to figure out who the students are and how that demographics is changing as we speak, and what is causing those changes, and what decisions about money and power have we been making that has led to these changes, before we then tackle these the more slightly more abstract questions, which are super important, but we also got to get the fundamentals right.
Yeah. One thing I would say too is I think, I think we should, as a flagship institution, we should be doing what Mike said, is spending our bubble thinking about how education can change, and inviting people from the other institutions here to host these sessions where we can together imagine new ways of teaching in the classroom that might be attractive to students to attend to these other universities. And then from an infrastructure standpoint, I'm an infrastructure guy, we have things here like the National Center for Supercomputing Applications. And one of the very interesting things happening is something called Illinois Chat, which is, as was mentioning earlier, this idea of AI sovereignty, where now we have supercompute where we're hosting whatever model you want. And teachers can use that to help with their coursework, to help answer some student questions, to supplement their TA hours, or just to experiment with different sorts of AI models on publicly funded compute resources. So I think it would be good for us to ensure that the other universities in our state, as the flagship, have access to those resources as well.
Just to quickly, I agree with everything. I think that the key thing here to me is that we are a blessed, endowed, privileged, afforded the opportunity to experiment. That many of the institutions that focuses on learning, teaching as their core mission do not have that kind of opportunity. So I think it's not only what we should do, but it's our responsibility to really flex that muscle a little bit at this amid this uncertainty, to try different things, create little projects, and start to think longer term. I mean, that's so that we can provide either a blueprint or some sort of path to say, this is the pathway to go, this is that pathway to go, other ways to go for the rest of the education landscape. What we shouldn't do, though, however, I do think in the context of this, is to focus too much on the enrollment grab in a sense that, amid a lot of uncertainty, what I'm worried about is some of the regional universities, the flagship, and that's not just us, across the state, demographic cliff, a lot of the uncertainties. If we focus too much on that kind of tuition-driven model, we're going to take away resources to surrounding university rather than empower them and enable them. So I think let them do what they do well, and we empower them to do what they do well, and we focus on what we do well, which is experimentation and doing longer term thinking, because we can afford to.
Time flies when you're having fun, folks. I'm very grateful to Meicen and Jake and Mike and Michael for lending us their time and expertise and ideas. If you enjoyed this event, there is more to attend. Learn more about our upcoming Summer of AI sessions, workshops, or panel discussions, either in person or remote. View the Summer of AI website and check out the calendar of events. The last Summer of AI session will be held on the last of July, July 31st. But we at CATL aim to maintain the momentum of the Summer of AI and continue to promote generative AI in ways yet to be determined beyond, July, going forward, into the fall semester of 2025. Thank you all for your attendance and for your participation, and see you at the next Summer of AI events, everyone.